Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us at The World Today, a weekly program at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times and that you registered to vote. I'm Michael Horowitz, Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll do my formal introduction in a moment, but before I begin, a few logistical notes. One, following the conversation, we will open the discussion up to questions that have been received from the audience. Two, to ask a question, please use the Q&A button in the middle of the Zoom interface at the bottom. Three, you will also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for any technical or other logistical issues. We will also drop resources in there like links to things during the event and as at its close as well. Finally, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. Welcome to today's event on Battlegrounds, the fight to defend the free world with Perry Worldhouse Distinguished Visiting Fellow, retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. We're excited to welcome Lieutenant General McMaster back here virtually to Perry Worldhouse to help launch his new book, and so that he could tell us a little bit about what went into it. As a 26th National Security Advisor of the United States from 2017 to 2018, H.R. McMaster was one of the architects of the current administration's national security policy. We're fortunate to have him spending a little time with us as a Perry Worldhouse Distinguished Visiting Fellow. As he's also the Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and has a number of other appointments at Stanford and elsewhere. He's a career Army officer. He was commissioned upon graduation from the United States Military Academy and served for 34 years. He also holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and wrote a book so good called Dereliction of Duty that I assigned it in my classes even before he was famous. So we're exceptionally happy to have him back here to talk about Battlegrounds. Welcome, Lieutenant General McMaster to Perry Worldhouse.
Hey, Mike, hey, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So to start, I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about the book, the overall argument in it, and what went into it to maybe set the stage. Then I'll ask you a couple questions and we'll open it up to the audience.
All right, hey, thanks, Mike. And I just want to say thanks to Perry Worldhouse for the help with the book and your role in particular in convening scholars and graduate students and undergraduates who criticized early drafts of chapters, gave me tremendous feedback and helped me improve it tremendously. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to be with everybody. I wanted to write a book about our most crucial challenges to our future, to our security, to peace and prosperity, and our influence in the world. And I was concerned. I was concerned as I served in places like Iraq and Afghanistan that oftentimes I was on the receiving end of policies and strategies based on really, I think, more on fantasy in Washington than reality on the ground in those places. And I wanted to write a book that would help us restore what I believe had been a loss of strategic competence, especially in the post-Cold War period, a loss of competence associated with the theme that runs through the book of what I'm calling strategic narcissism, which is our tendency to view the world only in relation to us, and to assume that what we do or decide not to do is decisive to achieving a favorable outcome. This is what makes us prone to optimism bias and confirmation bias and wishful thinking, and of course what's fundamentally flawed about that sort of an approach to foreign policy and national security is the failure to consider the other, especially rivals, adversaries, and enemies, and the degree of influence and agency and authorship over the future that they have. And so I'm hoping that this is a book that will help us understand better these crucial challenges to our security, and then understand better what we can do about them, what we, being the United States and other like-minded partners across the free world. Because I believe there is this overarching competition, Mike, these days between closed authoritarian systems and our free and open societies.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Middle East. You spent much of your career deployed in the Middle East and thinking about the Middle East. And in reading the book, one of the pieces that I think you're obviously the most passionate about is Iran. And tell us a little bit about how you think American strategy toward Iran has evolved, and essentially why is this still a thing 40 years later.
Right, right. Well, thanks, Mike. I mean, an approach that I take in the book is to understand how the past produced the present as a first and essential step to making any kind of suppositions about the future and determining what our policies ought to be. So on the Middle East, I think what we're seeing today is Americans are as you suggest, are saying, what the heck are we doing there? They see the Middle East mainly as a mess to be avoided. Many are frustrated with the unexpected length and difficulty and costs associated, especially with the war in Iraq and its aftermath, and then the subsequent disengagement from the region in the midst of the Arab Spring. I think Americans are puzzled by the intervention in Libya and then not doing anything to shape the political aftermath of Gaddafi's demise there, and of course witnessed the rise of ISIS, the most destructive terrorist organization in history, and the tremendous humanitarian catastrophe that has beset the Middle East associated with the rise of ISIS and the ongoing, really serial episodes of mass homicide that comprise the Syrian civil war. So there is this frustration, okay? This is kind of just seems to be a mess to be avoided. But the argument that I try to make in Battlegrounds is, just when you think the situation in the Middle East can't get worse, it actually does, right? Especially if we disengage completely and in a way that unleashes further these centripetal forces that are tearing the region apart. You mentioned Iran in particular. Iran has I think, the most blood on its hands in recent decades because of this 4-decade-long proxy war that it has been waging against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, and the Arab monarchies. And what Iran is doing today is perpetuating this cycle of sectarian violence that has created this humanitarian catastrophe, but is also mainly designed to keep the Arab world perpetually weak, so Iran can pursue its hegemonic designs in the region, can place a proxy army on the border of Israel and threaten Israel with destruction, and it is doing so by the application, in large measure, of the Hezbollah model broadly through the region, and that is essentially to have weak governments in power that are dependent on Iran to some degree for support, while Iran grows militias that can be turned against that government if that government acts against Iranian interests. So the title of the chapter on what to do about the Middle East broadly is entitled, Breaking the Cycle. I think we have to focus on breaking this cycle of sectarian violence, because it is that cycle of sectarian violence that has allowed Iran to gain power across the region. It is also what has kept these jihadist terrorist organizations on life support across the region, because these jihadist terrorists can portray themselves as patrons and protectors to fearful Sunni Arab communities who fear really evisceration at the hands of these militias. So breaking that cycle is important as well, because I think what's driving terrorism in particular, and this is the use of violence against innocents as their principal tactic, is a cycle of ignorance that is then used to foment hatred, and hatred that is used to justify violence against innocents. I mean, there are a lot of people getting educated, in Syria right now, or in these refugee camps. It is already a multi-generational problem, Mike, associated with these jihadist terrorist organizations, the alumni of which are orders of magnitude greater than the Mujahideen era alumni who attacked our country on September 11th. So it's more than a mess to be avoided. It's a mess that we have to cope with based on our own interests, but based on humanitarian concerns as well.
So one thing to shift from Iran to a country nearby, you've been very critical in recent weeks of proposed withdrawal of ongoing and proposed withdrawals of American forces from Afghanistan. To play devil's advocate, a critic might argue, hey, we've been there a while and it seems like it hasn't gotten any better. Why should we still be in Afghanistan? So, through the lens of Battlegrounds, could you tell us about the American military commitment to Afghanistan and why you think it's still so important?
Right. Well, I think we have to remember the reason we're in Afghanistan is because we suffered the most devastating terrorist attack in history on September 11, 2001. And it was the safe haven and support base given to Al Qaeda by the Taliban that made that attack possible. So it was altogether righteous, that we invaded Afghanistan when the Taliban would not give
Oh,
up
I mean,
some of the
people
land.
forget, I think, that like 95% of the American public supported, going into Afghanistan in the first
Absolutely.
place.
Absolutely. But what if Americans have been frustrated, as you mentioned, with this, almost 20-year-old war now? But the point that I try to make in Battlegrounds is, hey, it's not a 20-year long war. It's a 1-year war 20 times over. Our strategy toward Afghanistan has been inconsistent. It's been fundamentally flawed almost throughout that full course of 19 going on 20 years. And what's needed is a sensible, sustainable, long-term approach to security there that prioritizes operations against these terrorist organizations that, if they once again enjoy that in a support base, will again become a grave threat to all humanity, all civilized people, the United States included. We saw this before, Mike, by the way, not only on 9/11, but with the rise of ISIS, and ISIS in control of territory the size of Britain, control of territory they used to resource and train and prepare and organize, as well as inspire attacks as well, across Europe, and also attempted attacks in the United States, attempted attacks that have come also from this Khorasan region, a region that has great ideological significance, emotional significance to jihadist terrorists, much like the Fertile Crescent does in Syria and in Iraq. And so it's an important area because of our interests in securing our children, our way of life from terrorists who are determined to commit mass murder as their principal tactic in a war against all humanity. And it's also important because, if the Taliban were to gain control of large portions of Afghanistan, if they were to establish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, then what they will do is gain a tremendous psychological victory as well, Michael. They're already saying, what they're saying in Doha, Qatar, where we set up the Afghan government into a position of profound disadvantage, is they're saying, hey, we won. We beat the world's greatest superpower. What are we talking to you for? Let us tell you the terms that we're going to dictate. And of course, that begs the question, Mike, what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? Does that look like mass executions every other Saturday? Is that bulldozing every other girl's school? What does that look like? And so I think that it's abhorrent what we've done. We have, in many ways, partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan government, and done so under some fundamentally flawed assumptions. First of all, that there is this bold line between the Taliban and Al Qaeda and other groups. It's not. These groups are intertwined, demonstrably so. And secondly, this idea that maybe the Taliban's changed. Maybe they would impose a benevolent form of Sharia, which I just don't think any Afghans believe. I mean, we have in many ways partnered with the 5% against the 95%, and I think it's important to point out that Americans who are war weary, who are listening to this mantra of ending endless wars, we should recognize that 10 of our courageous soldiers gave their last full measure, made the ultimate sacrifice, fighting for our security and for humanity in Afghanistan this year. But we should also recognize that every day, approximately 30 Afghan soldiers and police give their lives to preserve the freedoms that they've enjoyed since the defeat of the Taliban in 2001. And the ousting of the Taliban from Kabul and out of power. So I think it is a worthy endeavor to sustain a modest troop commitment there, to enable Afghans to continue to bear the brunt of this fight against jihadist terrorists and their sponsors, who exist in an ecosystem in which there are about 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations. And all these groups share resources. Sometimes they're competition with each other and confrontation with each other, but they share people and expertise. And it's a very dangerous part of the world, in part because of Pakistan's support for these groups, and also in part because Pakistan's a nuclear armed country as well. So I just think that it's an insurance policy, Mike, to sustain our commitment there. But in the interest of withdrawing as an end in and of itself, I think we're creating unnecessary vulnerabilities, and I think ultimately we and others are going to pay the price for it.
So I want to shift from the sort of Middle East region over to the Pacific, and some other chapters in the book focus on the rise of China. You spent much of your career looking at both deploying to and focused on the Middle East, but as national security advisor and in other ways have also been focused on the rise of China. Would you say that's the number one challenge that the United States needs to face at this point? And how do you think about that in the context of the book?
Well, I would say it is the number one challenge, and one of the reasons why it grew into the challenge it is today is because we based our our policies on vis-a-vis China on a fundamentally flawed assumption, and that assumption is that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, and as it prospered, would liberalize its economy and ultimately liberalize its form of governance. Well, I mean, we know for a fact that the opposite is the case now. And why China is a threat is because of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the emotions and aspirations and ideology that drive and constrain that party. So that's what I begin with, really, in all these chapters, is try to emphasize what the historian Zachary Short calls strategic empathy, to view these challenges from the perspective of the other, with particular attention to, again, these emotions, aspirations, and ideologies that drive and constrain the other. The party is driven by fear, in part, fear of losing its exclusive grip on power. It is a small minority of the population in China. China is not monolithic or homogeneous, and the party is racing to establish this technologically enabled Orwellian surveillance police state. How's that for a lot of adjectives? And also engaged in a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang. Now with the national security law applied to Hong Kong, repressing human freedom there. So this is of concern, right? Of humanitarian concern to us. I mean, Uyghur birth rates are down 60%. There are over 1 million people in concentration camps. Xi Jinping gave a speech last week in which he said, hey, the Uyghurs love being re-educated in these camps. And in fact, we're building on a few additions so we can house more of them. And so this is egregious. 7,500 mosques have been destroyed, 8,500 more damaged. So I think we ought to be outraged about this across the free world and impose costs on the Chinese Communist Party for this behavior. But what is also of concern to us is the exportation of China's authoritarian mercantilist model at our expense. And this is really under three interrelated and overlapping strategies. First among these is military civil fusion. There is no distinction between the Chinese party and a Chinese company, because those companies have to act by law as an extension of the party. China is engaged in a sustained campaign of extracting sensitive technologies from us and intellectual property, which, because of military and civil fusion together, is applied to give the People's Liberation Army, which includes all of their armed forces, a differential advantage over us. And then the other programs involve Made in China 2025, in which China wants to dominate in the future data-driven global economy, and also wants to dominate in advanced manufacturing. The United States in this future world of theirs would export soybeans, and maybe some natural gas to China, as China uses its statist economic model and unfair advantages associated with it to dominate markets and to drive U.S. companies out of business and U.S. workers out of jobs. And so that's a threat, certainly. And then of course the One Belt One Road strategy, in which China creates servile relationships with companies under the auspices of infrastructure investment, for example, and indebting those countries beyond what they can service on that debt, and then gaining coercive power, and then using that debt sometimes to trade debt for equity, to take over critical infrastructure. China is financing through this status economic model the emplacement of fifth generation communications infrastructure around the world, because it wants to control the global logistics network and the global communications network, and to do so in a way that gives them preponderant advantage. We have to compete, Mike, because if China succeeds, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. And it's important for all of us to wake up to this competition. I think it's happening. I think the pendulum is swinging now, and the free world recognizes, hey, this is a threat that we have to cope with. We have to compete much more effectively than we have, based mainly on these flawed assumptions about what's driving the Chinese Communist Party.
Thanks a lot. I want to turn now to some of the questions that we're getting, and one question, and as a reminder, drop questions in the Q&A. We're reviewing them right now, and one asks about one of the big things on everybody's mind, which is COVID. America's facing a number of enormous challenges right now. We were talking before the event about some of them, and the question asks, how did your NSC plan for transnational threats like pandemics?
Yeah.
And how do you think the Trump administration has done in responding to the threat of COVID?
Well, there in the national security strategy, we identified 3 key tasks that really provided the framework for the national strategy for pandemic response and biomedical response, which was published in 2018. It actually reads pretty well, right? But the 3 tasks were stop the spread of a virus before it becomes a pandemic. That's task number 1, through more effective global surveillance and then containment once there is an outbreak. Well, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, we couldn't do that, right? This is the repression of any information about human-to-human transmission. This is shutting down domestic travel before international travel. It's punishing the doctors, right, who were trying to raise the alarm about it. It's a subversion of the WTO. Okay, let's put that aside, right? That didn't work. We have to get better at global surveillance. We have to get better at being able to contain an outbreak closer to its source before it becomes a pandemic. The second key task is to mobilize a biomedical response, and this is where we had the biggest breakdowns, right? And I think all of us should recognize, especially if those of us who study policy and everything, that you can write the perfect plan, but you can't. But that plan has to be implemented, right? And I think that where we saw breakdowns are breakdowns that occurred based on trends over multiple administrations, in particular, the fragility of supply chains associated with PPE, supply chains that prioritized efficiency over resiliency. And when we made efficiency decisions to deplete stockpiles and so forth. And so I'll tell you, the laws of physics still apply in the information age. And that's what we found out the hard way. When we were caught short, we couldn't mobilize the material that we needed. The other aspect of this is there's a breakdown there, a breakdown that I believe has been addressed now, and it will be addressed with more resilient supply chains, greater stockpiles. I mean, I think it was something like 18 million sets of PPE were stockpiled at the beginning of the crisis. Now there are 54 million, right? And the whole system is healthy now too. So, okay, it took too long. It was terrible. We were bidding against each other. Procurement systems were bad, which is the second problem. Second problem was in coordination of the response. Hey, we just have to realize, okay, we're a federal system of government, right? Which means that there's responsibility for this response at the federal level, at the state level, local level. We're also, in the area of healthcare, a mixture of public and private. The breakdowns were in coordination, not even having the same kind of data available in terms of logistics stockages, but also tracking the disease, for example, and being able to mobilize people as well as material resources in advance of waves of the disease, for example. And then of course, this was a novel coronavirus, and so there was a great deal of there were bad models, bad information, and we learned about it, about how it's transmitted, how to treat it, and so it's very important to learn all these lessons. I just led a lessons learned effort here at the Hoover Institution with some amazing Stanford students and one Georgetown student who worked on this, interviewed people across this response. It's recently published. I'll send you the link, and we could post. Maybe you could send out social media or something later for those who are interested. But what we wanted to do with this is we wanted to wring out all this crazy, partisan politics around COVID, right? And get to the real lessons. Okay, the third key task, right? Third key task is to innovate for therapies and, of course, a vaccine. I think that's going to be a success story. The therapies, as you're tracking, are getting more and more effective. The death rate is going down. We're getting better at protecting the vulnerable population, which was the vast majority of, or the majority of fatalities as well as those with with comorbidities and so forth. But now I think what we'll see is the payoff of years of investment in research and development in rapid vaccine prototyping and the capacity to produce vaccines at scale. I think that's going to be a success. Operation Warp Speed, General Gus Perna, who's running the logistics side of that, is one of the most competent, best officers I know, for example. And so I think that's going to be a success story. But the breakdown was in mobilizing a biomedical response, and there's a breakdown in implementation. And the other thing I'll just say is the president and the administration by connection has done a poor job at communications and these inconsistent messages. And I mean, as one who's commanded large organizations, to be effective at communications, you have to send a simple, clear message continuously, right? Or else you get what we call in the Army order, counter order, disorder, right? And so I think that there has been too much space. It's already was going to be hard, right? Fighting a new virus like this, but man, it seems like we want to make it as hard on ourselves as we can. And then the way it's become politicized. And now I know behind the scenes, Mike, there is a lot of really good coordination going on between the states and the federal government now. Like for example, the vice president's working group with governors, they work together extremely well, right? But it's it's the messages that come out at the highest level. It is it's the media, I think, amplifying this polarization as well. That's really been disappointing.
So I wonder if you could maybe expand on that. I mean, the elephant in the room, no pun intended, in some ways is President Trump and the polarization of the United States and the way that, as you were suggesting, partisanship has filtered into everything, but certainly America's response to the pandemic. As someone that is sort of, has attempted to be famously apolitical, how are you seeing that and what can we do about it?
Well, I think what we have to do is we have to take matters into our own hands, man. I mean, I just think, at places like Prairie World House, we have to have respectful discussions of these complex issues. We have to, and then, we can agree on so much, Mike, so much that we can work on together, but we immediately go to what we disagree on. And then what you see this kind of equal and opposite reaction effect. It's almost like, partisan politics physics, right? Is that you have a President Trump statement that is maybe inaccurate, maybe it's offensive, maybe it's it saps confidence in democratic principles and institutions and processes, but then oftentimes the reaction to that is equally damaging. And I just think we have to get out of this pendulum swing of partisanship and recognize that there were some failings. The big story, I guess of Woodward's book, was that the president downplayed the seriousness of the virus and maybe the noble hope that he could rally people to get through it, to not be as affected, maybe as psychologically, emotionally. But I found that in arduous conditions, combat, for example, it is best to tell your soldiers, best to tell your organization, best to tell, in this case, the country, everything you can about a problem. Because what happens when you do that? People take initiative. People figure things out. And we've seen tremendous adaptation across the private sector with volunteer organizations. I've had the privilege of working with a great organization called U.S. Civilian Corps, where like-minded people just came together and we said, okay, there's going to be a big shortage of people with the right expertise, especially in the medical specialties, as people get exhausted, as these amazing doctors and nurses who have been engaged with this crisis. So how do we mobilize more help for them and get them to the points of need ahead of these waves? And we worked on that and some other projects, lessons learned, best practices. And I think that all this gets drowned out by the negativity, right? And so there are actually incredibly positive stories of the response. I mean, look at what our essential workers are doing every day. The people who don't have the luxury of staying home and Zooming, and for their jobs, right? I mean, I think that, that we should take pride in what our fellow Americans have achieved under arduous conditions, what they've done, with how they volunteered, how they've worked so hard to care for one another. But I think that we're just doomed to emphasize only the negative these days because of how polarized we become from a partisan political perspective.
So let me shift the. I suspect the questions will drag us back to the U.S. But let me shift the lens abroad again and talk about.
Lest we be guilty of
Yeah.
strategic narcissism, Mike.
I'm curious what you think about U.S. engagement with international institutions, and specifically, how you think about the World Health Organization, America's relationship with it, with regards to the rise of COVID, China's influence in the World Health Organization, and then often it seems like there are hard choices about whether to engage with or withdraw from some of these institutions that say aren't doing the things the U.S. wants.
Yeah, right. Well,
how do you think about it?
I think what this we should learn, the main lesson we should learn from World Health Organization is there is no prize for membership in these organizations, right? That we have to be active participants and advocates for our free and open societies in competition with closed authoritarian systems, which are joining these organizations to subvert them, to turn them against their very purpose. The World Health Organization was designed in part to ensure effective global surveillance and early response. It was subverted to do the opposite of that. Why the director is still there is, I think, is at least questionable, right? I mean, I think anybody who failed to the extent that he failed should have resigned immediately. But there are those who want to keep him in there because he went to congratulate Xi Jinping on how well he handled this pandemic as he was foisting it on the world. And so, I think that's a travesty. But take a look at the Human Rights Council, which Russia and China just rejoined. I mean, it's laughable, right? It's laughable. In both cases, the U.S. has withdrawn, at least for now, from the World Health Organization and from the Human Rights Council, because the Human Rights Council became a farce. I mean, it was a complete farce. I think what's preferable when you can is to compete within those organizations to make sure they're not turned against their purpose. And I think a recent example of that is the U.S. competed effectively to prevent China from taking over the organization that governs international patents and intellectual property rules, which would have been just, again, sad but laughable almost if China, who was engaged in a sustained campaign of industrial espionage with the APT-10 cyber hacking sustained campaign, as well as other means, as well as engaging in the forced transfer of intellectual property, were to be in charge of the organization. So I think we have to compete within these organizations, make sure they're not turned against their purpose, and we can do that. I mean, we should be able to have the preponderant voice with like-minded partners across the world.
So so many of the questions that chatter about the Middle East. So let's drop back there for a sec. There's one. We have one question pushing back. It's something that you said. You suggested the U.S. was disengaging from the Middle East, and with the questioner wants to know, sort of with the Abraham Accords, with U.S. support for Saudi, in other activities. What is that what disengagement really looks like?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I may have misspoke. I was arguing against disengagement. I believe in some ways we are disengagement. You've seen the reduction of troops, for example, in Iraq. You saw the president's halting withdrawal out of Syria and our partnership with the Syrian Defense Forces. That, I think, is wrong. I think that ISIS is not completely defeated. I think we learned from disengagement previously. We should have learned from disengagement previously, from a military perspective anyway, and a diplomatic perspective. What a mistake it was to disengage from Iraq in December 2011. I think you draw a straight line from that to the rise of ISIS, the return of large-scale sectarian violence, the return of ISIS in control of territory the size of Great Britain. I think you also now see that there is certainly a cost and risk associated with action in the Middle East. But there's also a cost and risk associated with inaction. And this, I would say in particular, would have to do with the Syrian civil war and the decision to not enforce the red line in Syria in 2013. So 2014. That's what I would argue against. I think the Abraham Accords are a tremendous development, a positive development. We ought to take a moment to celebrate good news when it comes out of the Middle East, because it doesn't happen that often. And I think what is promising about the Abraham Accords is the recognition, that Iran is the main threat in the region that's perpetuating this psycho-sectarian violence, and as a result, the interests of the Gulf states and those of Israel, from a defense perspective, align. I think what's also important is the name, right? The name Abraham Accords, that sends a strong message. They were all people of the book. And so that sends a message important to Iran, as I mentioned, but to jihadist terrorists, and can help isolate them from sources of ideological support and their ability to use a perverted interpretation of Islam to justify violence against innocents. Of course, the vast majority of the victims of these groups are fellow Muslims, right? So it's important for us to deny this narrative of these terrorists, that this is a war of religion, or to deny them the ability to cloak their criminality with some kind of religious legitimacy. I think this goes back to President Trump's speech in Riyadh, the first trip. Remember, everybody's like, "What the heck is Donald Trump doing going to Saudi Arabia?"
You mean that was the one with the orb, right?
That was the orb was not during the speech. It was after the speech.
Right. No, but that was the trip with the orb. I mean, who can forget the orb? I mean, all the things that have happened in the Trump administration, like the orb.
Yeah, it is a significant and indelible image for us. But I think what's significant about that orb, that was opening up a center for countering Islamist ideology, extremist ideology, jihadist ideology, and Salafi jihadist ideology. So I think, there has been some progress on that. Saudi Arabia, as we know, was the greatest proselytizer of this perverted interpretation of Islam. Which
like there's some irony in the Saudis opening a center to like counter Salafi ideology.
But if we follow through, as we have with the Center for Countering Terrorist Financing and Extremist Financing, which has had actually some very successful multinational actions, financial actions associated with it, then I mean, I think that's progress, right? And the Saudis are problematic allies. I mean, most prominent example of this is obviously the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a U.S. resident and a journalist, abhorrent. But I think that it's important to remain engaged, to encourage the kind of reforms that can, over time, eliminate the scourge of jihadist terrorism, a scourge that is mainly inflicted the most pain and suffering on people of the region.
So I want to turn now to sort of right around there, which is the one of the ongoing war essentially that most Americans aren't paying attention to, but I'm sure you are, which is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And we have a question that just came through asking, how do you think I guess maybe a way to ask this is, what should the United States be doing about that conflict, if anything? I could imagine some people saying that's not America's business. Like that's a tragedy. The America should stay out. I could see other people saying that's an important area for global competition, given Russian interests there, and the U.S. needs to be engaged in some way. But then the question is how? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to try to mediate a ceasefire immediately, and then try to get to some kind of political settlement that will at least ensure that the violence is abated for some time while we work on a longer term settlement. I mean, I think there is no substitute for U.S. diplomatic leadership here, along with certain EU countries. France has been active in this area and on this issue in particular in recent days. But I think we have to work to break this violence, stop this violence. And recognize that this is a really dangerous development in context of the Turks' use of proxy forces, not only in support of the Azerbaijanis against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also in Idlib province in Syria, and also in Libya in support of the government and national accord. In all three of these conflicts, Turkish proxies and Turkish-enabled forces are engaged against Russian proxies and Russian-enabled forces, and so you have this is a much broader dynamic associated with an increasingly aggressive Turkey that is acting out in some ways based on the hyper nationalist agenda of Erdogan. that does have as well an Islamist streak through it, through the the Naqshbandi Sufi ideology of the AKP, and the use of Islamist ideology to recruit many of these militiamen who he is employing. These groups, as you know, they're not never homogeneous. They overlap with other groups. They overlap with groups like Nusra and Al Qaeda and so forth. And so I think Turkey is complicit now in in creating a future security problem associated with the alumni of these militias, young people now who know nothing but how to fight, right? Who have been recruited, and these are many of them are Syrians, right? Many of these are displaced Syrians who Turkey is mobilizing and employing in Nagorno-Karabakh on the side of the Azerbaijanis. So I think I think it is a much bigger conflict than what we're witnessing, and it's worth us mediating on, putting pressure on both Russia and Turkey to control their proxy forces, their partners, their whatever, their the forces that they're supporting.
So this is actually one of the first times Russia's come up in our conversation so far, and so I want to go there now. I mean, you talk about it in your book, and what would an optimal U.S. strategy toward Russia look like? It seems like we've tried some different things over the last 15 or 20 years, and frankly, it hasn't worked all that well.
No, it hasn't worked, because I think all three administrations who have been in power in the U.S. during Putin's reign as apparently the new czar of Russia, have labored under the illusion, the hope that a better relationship with Putin would lead to Putin abandoning this campaign against us, this sustained campaign of political subversion against Europe and the United States in particular. Recall that President George W. Bush, right, looked into Putin's soul, and then Secretary Clinton brought the reset button to Lavrov, and then President Obama leaned over to Medvedev, was keeping the seat warm for Putin, and said, more flexibility after the elections, and traded off missile defense in Poland in the hope of a better relationship. And then President Trump labors under the same delusion, right? Hey, a good relationship with Russia would be a good thing, not a bad thing. Well, I mean, kind of the news flash from Battlegrounds is it's not going to happen under Putin, right? That Putin is driven by really a sense of honor lost during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a drive to restore Russia to national greatness. Now, Putin recognizes the limitations that he has, right? He can't compete head to head. The Russian economy is stagnant. It's about the size of Texas's economy or Italy's economy. But it's a dangerous country because, well, first of all, it has nuclear weapons, but also when you're unscrupulous, you can cause a lot of problems. And so you see Russia using this new form of warfare, what I call in the book, Russian New Generation Warfare, and these efforts to accomplish his objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted response against Russia. So I think what we need to do is put together that concerted response to impose costs on Putin beyond those that he factors in prior to taking an aggressive action, like the poisoning of Navalny, for example, like the intervention in the Syrian civil war, like the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine. Russia these days is able to get away with a lot because they're an arsonist that poses as a fireman, right? So in the Syrian civil war, for example, they help create and perpetuate these episodes of mass homicide, create a humanitarian crisis of colossal scale and a refugee crisis, and then set up these venues where they act as if they're trying to resolve the crisis. Some people have fallen for this. This is what I call in Battlegrounds Putin's Potemkin peace plan, and
I mean, that's it's 4 P's in a row. You've got some alliteration. I mean, it's great. It's great.
Right, alliteration can't go wrong with that, right? So this is the idea that Putin puts forward to Gulf Arab states and to Israel. Says, hey, just work with me here. Keep Assad in power, right? Guarantee Russian interests in a post-Civil War Syria, and we'll work over time to limit Iranian influence in a post-Civil War Syria. Well, I mean, that's a lie, first of all, because Assad is much more reliant on the Iranians than he is on Russian support. But Russia gets away with it because they give a little bit. I mean, the Israeli Defense Forces conducted hundreds of strikes into Syria unimpeded by the Russians. I think as part of this of part of this arrangement. The UAE reopened the embassy, in Damascus, and I think what Russia really wants to do is get the Gulf states to write checks to reconstruct the country that it helped to destroy. That would be a huge mistake, Mike. So this is just one example of impose costs on Russia. Don't sign up, for this, for Putin's Potemkin peace plans.
So I think one thing that I can't help but point out is that the way that you talk about the threat and challenge posed by Russia is different than the way that the President of the United States talks about Russia.
In what way, Mike? No, I'm just joking. Go ahead.
And so as a follow-up to that, we have a question in our chat from somebody who you may know, Courtney Cube from NBC News, who wants to know if you'll tell us who you're voting for and why.
No way. No. Hey, what I try to do with this book and what I'm going to try to do with this second career, right? I mean, I went into West Point when I was 17 years old. I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Donald Trump was the 5th commander-in-chief that I served. And I took, this is an extreme position. I don't advocate this for others. I think certainly every citizen should vote, right? But I chose not to vote across my active duty military career so that I could do my part in keeping this bold line, between the military and partisan politics. I believe that's what is eating us up today is this hyperpartisanship. And I believe that there's so much we can agree on. I mean, the challenges I write about in Battlegrounds, I mean, these should not be partisan issues, Mike. We should be able to work on these challenges together to build a better future for generations to come. I think, if I get involved in endorsing this candidate or that candidate, I mean, you automatically alienate one side of that hyperpartisan, the hyperpartisan continuum here, right? And what I want to do is hopefully communicate to the American people what are maybe some criteria you might use to evaluate the candidates on your own terms, based on what is in America's interests and the free world's interests, and so that's what I hope. That's what I want to do with the book, and not say who I'm going to vote for, or who's fit or unfit, or any of that. I am very, very critical in the book on some Trump administration policies. I was today, on Afghanistan in particular. But I also give the administration credit for I think the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and that's the competitive stance to China. I'm also critical of previous administrations. So I mean, the idea is that we have to be able to, I think you have two choices essentially these days anyway, to either try to transcend, this vitriolic partisan discourse or get sucked down into it. Right. And I respect others who are being more direct about it. Admiral McRaven, I mean, I have tremendous respect for him.
Sorry, just to interrupt for a second. I was kind of curious. We have a couple other questions in the chat that, one of which even says you are famously apolitical, but, sort of how are you thinking about all of that at this moment in American history? And so you're mentioning McRaven makes me wonder if you can, you've written a lot about civil military relations. Yeah. And so I'm curious if you could maybe expand on that a little.
Well, this goes back to our founders, right? So you have to maybe humor me, Mike, and let me go back to the founding as an American historian, right? We have to remember George Washington's grandparents fled the English Civil War, and foremost on the minds of our founders was this bold line between the Army in particular, the military, and politics and partisan politics in particular. And so it's very important for us to maintain our military professionalism that depends in large measure on our separation, from partisan politics, and a recognition that what is unique in our democracy is we swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I think that if we were to get involved in partisan politics, we would lose that professionalism and we would lose the support of the American people. And you know what? Hey, when you're, when bullets are coming your way, you're not looking at the man or woman next to you and checking, their political party affiliation. or their skin color, or their religion, or their sexual orientation, right? You're in it together. You're part of a family. You're part of a family that is working together on a mission much larger than themselves, much larger than any kind of partisan political affiliation, right? And we need the best, of our country, regardless of what your political predilections are, to join our armed forces. And we could jeopardize that if we get drug into politics. And I respect, as I mentioned, my former colleagues, my fellow washed up generals and admirals, to endorse whoever they want, to say whatever they want. They're free to do that. But I think, some of the actions, like the dueling lists of admirals and generals. Hey, look how many admirals and generals I have. Well, I think I got a few more than you. And then I think that inadvertently, drags the military into politics. Responsibility for maintaining our apolitical nature and our professionalism lies with the profession. This goes back to Sam Huntington, right? The soldier of the state. But it also lies with the
for those watching, we've got a couple hundred people on here from the Penn community and beyond. We're getting very academic now.
I think this comes with a cost, right? If there is the appearance of partisanship. So I'm trying to transcend it, and that's my personal choice, and I respect the choices that others make.
So would you think about, another question in the chat that asked, would you think about going back into national service in a future administration?
Sure. Yeah, I would. I mean, service to me is the greatest gift. I really, across my military career, I got to work with extremely dedicated, talented, men and women. You're part of a team in which the person next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. And these intangible rewards of service are something that, I really felt I would really miss a lot. I kind of do, but being at a university, I feel as if it's the best landing I could have had in the second career, to be able to work with young Americans who also have this desire to serve, who are incredibly talented, who, restore your faith in our future every time you interact with them, as I'm sure it is the case at Penn as well. So, and I know is because I'm part of Perry Worldhouse's team and have had the privilege of interacting with your graduate students and undergraduates. So, I'm happy with what I'm doing now, but I'll tell you, the National Security Advisor job's a great job. I got used up in it. I only had a 13-month long shelf life, but I was at peace with that, right? I decided, okay, this is a bonus round for me. I was in my 33rd year of service already when I quite unexpectedly was called to Mar-a-Lago to interview for the job. I really, in particular, appreciated the opportunity to work with, the dedicated professionals on the National Security Council staff and then across the departments and agencies. I think we made a positive difference. But Washington is a odd place, right? And there are a lot of reasons to go to Stanford, and I did not consider the fact that it's quite distant from Washington as a disadvantage when I decided to come here.
Fair enough. So suppose you were advising another administration, whether it was a second term of Trump or a Biden administration. What do you think are maybe the three most important national security priorities that the next administration needs to do to sort of get America's house in order, from a national security perspective?
I would say maintain and expand on the competitive approach to China, with an emphasis on deepening and broadening international cooperation on the key issues associated with Chinese Communist Party aggression. That would be number one. An addendum to that would be, don't fall for the same old tricks. And there are really a lot of smart people who would come into either administration. I'm not really concerned about this, but don't fall for the false promise of progress, for example, on environment. When in fact we know that the Chinese Communist Party is funding it and constructing 70 coal-fired plants a year, right? Just know that that's going to be a false promise, and really continue to compete effectively. The second is to not let up on Iran. I think that would be a big mistake. I think that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was well-meaning, but what it turned out to be is a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic victory, right?
Tell us what you really think about it.
Well, what happened is, I think with Iran, and I argue this in the book, is that we divorce our diplomatic efforts with Iran from two fundamental realities. The first is the nature of the regime and the ideology that drives it. And second, associated with that is the recognition that Iran based this regime's based on its permanent hostility to the United States, Israel, the Arab monarchies in the West, has waged a 40-year-long proxy war against us, right? And what was sad about the JCPOA is not only the deficiencies in the agreement itself, the sunset clause, the problems in verification and inspection, for example, that it didn't include the missile programs. I mean, all of those, what people point out as flaws in the deal. The problem is with the relaxation of sanctions and the huge payout up front, it gave the regime resources to intensify that proxy war against us. And that's exactly what they did. And I show the evidence in the book of, how that money was transferred directly to the intensification of the proxy war, and how, sadly, this corrupt regime in Iran is in control of the businesses that are on the receiving end of letters of agreement and contracts, and then profiting, from the integration back into the international economy. So, it didn't have the desired effect of growing, alternative power bases, and then convincing Iran, hey, look how good it is to be integrated into the international order under the the philosophy that the regime will fundamentally change. Under Khamenei, I think under who would ever come after him, he's getting old, he's getting up there, and the Guardian Council and the RGC. I mean, the revolutionaries have won in Iran. And I think our policy has to reflect that. So that's the second. Hey, the third aspect, I think, is a sustained effort against jihadist terrorist organizations. I think that this mantra of ending endless wars and seeing disengagement as an end in and of itself, I think neglects the reality that, hey, there aren't any short-term solutions to long-term problems. And by the way, these jihadist terrorists are getting more dangerous. They're orders of magnitude larger than the Mujahideen era elite. They have access to more destructive capabilities. They have encrypted communications and advanced technologies. I'm thinking of Audrey Cronin's book, Power to the People, which is very good on this point. And so we have to sustain that effort. Now, it doesn't mean we have to take the brunt of the fight, but it means we have to stay engaged with like-minded partners who are really taking the brunt of the fight, as I mentioned, as the Afghans are. We can talk about North Korea if you want to, but I think those would be the top three. Is
All right.
China, Iran, because that relates to the broader Middle East issue, and then the broader efforts against jihadist terrorists, with an emphasis maybe on Afghanistan.
So my bet is that if you surveyed a lot of younger people, maybe in the Penn community, a thing that might be on that list, maybe even in the top three, would be climate change.
Yeah. Right.
So I understand it wasn't in your top three, but tell us a little bit about how you think about the challenge posed by climate change, both more broadly and is this a national security challenge for the United States?
Yeah, it's a national security challenge, and it's an immediate challenge. It's not a future challenge. It's a now challenge, right? And I do write about this in Battlegrounds, and this is one of these topics on which I lament the fact, right, that we seem to only talk about what we disagree on instead of what we can agree on. And then so you have this interaction, this polar interaction again between climate deniers and the Green New Deal. Okay, so we can't afford any longer to deny climate change. We can't afford any longer to pose non-solutions to the problem, right? What we need are economically viable solutions that are applicable in developing economies as well as in developed economies. Because as you know, carbon emissions don't respect national boundaries, right? And so it's important to address the largest carbon emitters in the world, those whose trajectories are all in the wrong direction. This would be China, India, and now Africa. And to do so with a range of already available solutions to this, right? We can do this. We can actually do it in a way that's economically viable. And so what can we agree on? Climate change is happening. Yes. Climate change is man-made. Yes. It's bad. Yes. And we can do something about it. So let's do it. Okay. And what we can do is view the problem holistically. We have to recognize that there are interconnected problems of climate, environment, energy, food security, water security, and this impinges and affects health security as well. There are the solutions, as I mentioned, cheaper renewables, a bridge capability for fossil fuels to shift from coal to natural gas. The largest reduction in carbon emissions in history was in the United States, and it was due to the availability of cheap natural gas, which provided an economic incentive, not a big government program, economic incentive to transition from coal electrical generation to natural gas. And then there are a range of other actions that are complementary to this, which includes better management of the agricultural food chain, and reduction of food waste, which is a big carbon emission source as well. So I lay this out in the book, in general terms. Obviously, I couldn't go into a lot of detail, but I'm confident that we can do this. I think next generation nuclear is another big part of the solution, especially if you look at countries that don't have a lot of national infrastructure. That means power generation has to be more localized. You can do that with some renewables, but those renewables don't generate 24 hours a day. Oftentimes it's wind, solar, for example. These modular nuclear capability, which by the way, are much safer, don't need the vast water sources to operate, are on the cusp of being economically feasible with some more investments and bridge to production. I mean, I think these solutions exist, right? But you can't just say, like for Germany's case, hey, we're going to get rid of all nuclear and we're going to go all renewable. Well, guess what they're doing now? I mean, they're over relying on high carbon emitting sources as a result. And by the way, by putting in Nord Stream 2, which is the dirtiest natural gas in the world coming from Russia, they've given Russia a coercive power over their economy and their energy sector. So we just have to be smart about it, and it has to be applicable to developing economies as well. But I would. That's in. I was looking at geostrategic threats. That's what I would call a cross-cutting threat to our security.
Well, thank you, sir. We are about out of time here, and thank you for these insights. It's always great to have you back at Perry Worldhouse when possible, as a native son of the Philadelphia area, and we're excited to, when someday this is all behind us, to have you back in person.
Well, I'll tell you, the hope I have for the future is the students that I've met, at Perry Worldhouse at UPenn, and I'll tell you, it's been a real pleasure every moment that I've had with you and the team. I regret that we can't interact in person as we did just a year ago, or even less than a year ago. But thanks for your leadership at Perry Worldhouse, Mike. Thanks for the privilege of being with you.
And thanks to everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you next week. We have 3 exciting events. We'll ask whether China will save the planet, building on McMaster's answer on climate change. We will have an event on public service in the 21st century with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. And we'll review the efforts of Hurricane Sandy for New York City's resilience planning. More information on all of that and links to register in the chat. You'll be able to access a recording of this on our YouTube channel. You can find out about our other upcoming events by joining our mailing list, and follow us on social media at Perry Worldhouse, and buy H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, which I have dropped a link to in the chat. And if you Google, you will easily find. Thank you very much for joining us, sir, and have a great day.
Great to see you, Mike. Thanks, everybody.